Can you? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn today. We are so honored to have Mr. Brian Smith to be our keynote speaker. As you know, Brian has been a distinguished real estate lawyer for over 20 years and currently serve as a partner at the law firm of South, Ehrlich, and Lankoff, where he specializes in defending the E&O lawsuits. In addition to his work in the law firm, Brian is also the corporate lawyer for our company. And he will be glad to help you with any legal matters. He's a very amiable person. You can even call him personally, and he'll be much willing to help you on any legal matters. And over the past years, Brian has delivered numerous legal seminars to our agent, most often in persons. But today, because of personal inconvenience, he won't be able to join us in person, but he will do it through Zoom. But we are confident that the value and clarity of his presentation will be no difference. Now, the topic for today's talk is nuts and bolts of the residential purchase agreement. So without further ado, let's welcome Brian Smith. Brian, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, Peter. Thanks for having me. And I'm glad to be here with you, just, share with you some information about how to, make your transaction successful and stay away from lawyers, stay out of lawsuits, legal disputes, claims in your transaction, help you efficiently close your transactions. I'm focusing on today how to use the residential purchase agreement, navigating it, the nuts and bolts of it, using it to your advantage. It's prepared by CAR. So this is a form which is crafted for the convenience of the real estate agent, for efficiency, and for sellers and buyers, the consumers to be able to understand. So the first, and you should also hopefully have my outline with you. You can follow along with that. I will have my outline on the screen. I'll scroll through it as I'm doing the seminar. I also have a sample residential purchase agreement. I'll show you some portions of that, and we'll learn how this important document works. And for the residential purchase agreement, of course, I mean the California Association of Realtors residential purchase agreement that you're going to be using as a listing agent, as a buyer's agent in a transaction. And the first thing to know about this is be sure you are using the CAR form residential purchase agreement. If you are a listing agent and you get an offer from the other side, and that offer is just typewritten up as a Microsoft Word document, it's a contract, but it's not on the CAR form, that's a red flag. You want to talk to your manager about that. Agents should always be using the CAR forms. And there's, of course, the residential purchase agreement for homes. There's a different RPA for vacant land. There's also a different purchase agreement for commercial properties. Keep in mind, you want to make your agency disclosures before an offer is made. So when the offer is made, your client understands whose interests you are representing. You're providing an offer to your client, say you're a buyer's agent. They are going to sign it. They're going to initial it. You should first, knowing your client, knowing their experience with real estate transactions, or maybe they don't have experience, maybe their age, just habits they have. How do they want to receive? I always recommend ask your client, do you want me to come over to your house and review this with you? Are you okay if I email it to you just as an attachment to an email? May I send you this by DocuSign? Do you use DocuSign? If you don't use DocuSign, I can just email it to you. Maybe you like fax. So don't assume that your client will just receive it by DocuSign and understand how to use DocuSign, and that will go smoothly. So ask your client, how do they want to transmit it? Another like basic threshold issue with the residential purchase agreement, listing agent, buyer's agent, is who is your counterpart? And by that, I mean, who are you dealing with on the another side of the transaction? I have a case right now that I'm working on. I'm representing a listing agent. and the buyer's agent on the other side of the transaction, well, I hesitate to even say buyer's agent. It was an attorney who was licensed, as an attorney who was also a real estate agent. So if you're that listing agent and your buyer's agent is a real estate agent, but also an attorney, that is a transaction where you want to be careful you don't get in over your head. Tell your manager that I want you to know that the person I'm dealing with on the other side of the transaction is also an attorney, because as an attorney, we have these classes, this training, this little bit higher level of knowledge of contracts, and you don't want to get from that buyer's agent who's also an attorney an addendum to the purchase agreement that is 2 pages long, single space, and has all these legalistic terms, and you're kind of getting in over your head there. So if your buyer's agent wears some hat other than a buyer's agent, such as an attorney. Maybe it's also buyer's agent is an architect or buyer's agent is an accountant. That's a transaction where you may want to be a little more careful and talk with your manager. The residential purchase agreement. Remember, we're dealing with what we call the new residential purchase agreement. It's really not that new anymore now in 2025, but it's new in terms of the life of real estate transactions in California. I believe it was 2021 when CAR started changing it over, and it's now the new residential purchase agreement, and it has at the start a summary or a checklist of key terms. Let me show you that. I have an RPA here with me, and I'm going to scroll over to that quickly so you can actually see the RPA on your screen. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so here is paragraph 3. Let me share it with you all. Hmm. My sharing isn't working that well. Hang on one second. Okay, it's not letting me share that one. So I'm just going to, as I said, tell you that at the start of the purchase agreement, there is that paragraph 3, and that uh, lets you, uh, it gives a summary of the key terms of the purchase agreement. Okay, and the contract terms in the purchase agreement. The purchase agreement allows you to set forth the length of the escrow. 30 days here is typical. Th should you go for a longer escrow? Should you go for a shorter escrow? More aggressive offer, a less aggressive offer? I would say put into your residential purchase agreements 30 days. The residential purchase agreement then sets forth at the start of it the deposit, the earnest money deposit. That's another key term of the residential purchase agreement. Okay. And okay, the residential purchase agreement. The well-established standard for the earnest money deposit is 3%. That is the standard that is intended to compensate a seller if the buyer somehow backs out of the transaction. 3% is the standard, but if a seller asks the buyer for more, I would consider that to be a red flag. It is provided within 3 business days. Remember, it's 3 business days, not calendar days. And when does a seller get to have the 3%, the liquidated damages clause? Well, if the buyer breaches the purchase agreement, then the seller then the seller has a right to the liquidated damages clause. If the buyer properly cancels within the terms of the purchase agreement, then the buyer gets the 3% return to him. It's known as liquidated damages for the seller. However, there are a lot of cases where a dispute arises between the buyer and the seller over whether the 3% can be returned. The 3% is held by escrow. It is not released by escrow unless there is mutual agreement of seller and buyer. Why? Because escrow is a neutral agent. It cannot release those funds unless it has permission of both sides. Under the purchase agreement, you remember paragraph 29 is the liquidated damages clause. Both seller and buyer need to initial that paragraph to signify that they are agreeing that escrow holds the 3% until there's a mutual agreement that it is released. Under the next part of my outline, that's paragraph 5, it is the loan. And most of our buyers in these situations, they're getting a loan for the property. They're not paying all cash. The thing to keep in mind here is that as the real estate agent, you're not a mortgage broker. So your role should be to refer the buyer to the mortgage broker, but not to give loan advice. Don't say to your buyer, "Oh, I'm sure you'll qualify for this loan." Say, "Here's my friend who's the mortgage broker. I suggest you contact her." The other important consideration is to start the loan process early. Have your buyer begin the qualification process before making the offer. With buyers, trying to buy that house. They really want it. As the buyer's agent, don't exaggerate your buyer's financial abilities to the listing agent. Just accurately convey what your buyers will offer. You could say it's all cash. My buyer can pay all cash 2 million for this house. However, I wouldn't say my buyer is the star of this TV show and he can pay all cash. He's got tons of money. Or my buyer is the most prominent doctor here and makes $800,000 a year. So giving away that specific information about income, you want to be careful that you're not saying too much, that you're not perhaps running astray of any confidential information. So I would say that to the listing agent, it's 2 million. My buyer will be able to pay that all cash. Here's a proof of funds. A proof of funds, the best way to do it is to have it be a bank statement with the buyer's name and address on that. I see a lot of cases where the proof of funds is a screenshot on the buyer's cell phone. It doesn't show the buyer's name. It doesn't show an account number or just part of an account number. It doesn't show the buyer's address. That can be a little bit, questionable because the listing agent, if a dispute comes up, may say, well, I'm not even sure that is the buyer's own account. So the best way is to do it kind of the more old-fashioned way, have your buyer download from their online account an actual bank statement with the name and address and account number. The residential purchase agreement, it is a contract. So when we talk about contracts, people perform under contracts if contingencies have been satisfied. So under the residential purchase agreement, key issues are what contingencies does a buyer have under the contract. If a contingency has not been satisfied, then the party doesn't have to perform under the contract. If the contingency has not been satisfied, then a buyer can cancel the contract. The contingencies that you'll see in your transactions are loan contingencies, appraisal contingencies, investigation contingencies. Review a seller documents. It's related to the investigation contingency, but under the residential purchase agreement, it's written up as a separate contingency. The thing I want you to keep in mind here is what time period is best for your buyer. How much time does your buyer need? You're going to balance that against making your offer attractive to the seller. So if you're asking for the standard 17 days for investigation of the property, okay, your buyer can have that under the contract, but that offer probably is not as likely to be accepted. So you may want to shorten the contingency period to say 10 days. Um, that should give your buyer enough time to do the home inspection, review the home inspection report, maybe talk with the home inspector, perhaps even have a second inspector, like an actual contractor, come out to the property and take a look at those cracks in the floor, see how they could be repaired. Another key issue, and I'm dealing with this in a case right now, is being clear on when the contingency period starts. So your buyer has a contingency period, right? Let's say it's 10 days to investigate this property, but when does that contingency period start? Well, what happens if you get, and this goes back to like that example I was telling you, let's say your buyer's agent is a real estate agent and an attorney, or somehow your buyer's agent is really aggressive. So they send you an addendum to the residential purchase agreement. And instead of the typical time period for when contingencies start to run, it says buyer's investigation contingency begins when seller delivers transfer disclosure statement, seller property questionnaire. Okay, that's fine. That's the way it usually goes. What if it says investigation contingency begins when seller delivers to buyer's agent all documents related to repairs of the property during seller's ownership of the property? And as the listing agent, and perhaps your seller is also thinking, well, what does all repairs mean? Does that mean when the roof leaked? Does that mean when there was mold in the bathroom? Does that mean also when I then repaired all the fixtures in the bathroom? Does that mean the cracks in the garage also? Does it mean when there was that fire in the oven in the kitchen and we had to do new oven, new countertops in the kitchen? Does that mean one of those things? Does that mean all of those incidents over my ownership? I mean, does that even mean when the toilet backed up and I had to call the Roto-Rooter guy to snake the toilet or snake the shower? Does that really mean every repair of any nature I've done to this property over my 20 years of ownership, I have to find and give the seller all the buyer's agent all the documents related to those? Perhaps the buyer could interpret it to mean that. I've seen that happen in a case. It's an unusual case, but a listing agent, the seller, they want clarity. They don't want to have to dig through every document that they've ever gathered over 20 years of ownership of the property. They probably don't even have them, first of all. And they don't want to be in a situation where, so let's say the listing agent finds the documents related to the mold in the bathroom, provides those to the buyer's agent and says, unfortunately, we have no further documents. But the buyer's agent somehow doesn't believe that, keeps insisting on more documents. So then you're kind of in a dispute about when does the contingency period start. And the way to avoid that is to be very clear if there's an addendum that changes when the contingency period starts, keep it narrow, keep it simple. Say contingency period begins when transfer disclosure statement, seller property questionnaire are provided. The buyer insists on more, you could add contingency period begins when the TDS, the SPQ, and the architectural plans for the 2022 remodel of the house are provided. But if you leave it open-ended for all documents related to repairs of the property, that puts you in a situation where maybe you don't even know when your contingency period starts. And then situation is you don't really know how to move the transaction along. When can you serve a notice to perform to your buyer if they really haven't completed if they're dragging their feet and your transaction is going on 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, but they haven't removed contingencies. So if a buyer wants more documents to trigger a contingency period, keep it simple and be very clear. Contingency removals, well, we know when a buyer removes contingencies, that's when he is obligated or committed to the contract. He's saying that I no longer need more time to investigate. I no longer need more time to obtain my loan. The issue there to keep in mind is that use the form. A conversation, a text, or an email does not remove the contingency period. A contingency can be extended by mutual agreement of buyer and seller, but please try to meet your deadline on your contingencies. So, cancellation of the contract. Let me pull up my agreement here. All right, so we know that a contract is a contract in any kind of business transaction. It's a car lease, maybe it's a house lease, or a contract for the purchase and sale of real estate. It has two sides, a buyer and seller. There could be issues on both sides. Well, either side could want to cancel. So, can you cancel a residential purchase agreement? A California Association of Realtors residential purchase agreement? A seller can, or a buyer can, or they can both mutually agree to. Like I said before, can you do it by email? Can you do it by an email? Can you do it by a text? No, you cannot. Whenever you're working with a residential purchase agreement, there is a CAR form to use. So use your forms. Why seller wants to cancel? Well, let's think about this. Why would a seller want to cancel? Well, maybe the buyer doesn't put the earnest money deposit into escrow. Maybe a buyer doesn't, like I was just talking about, a buyer doesn't remove a contingency. Those would be typical reasons a seller is getting frustrated, wants to, move a buyer along or get out of this transaction. So those are reasons that a seller, and a listing agent can cancel a transaction. Um, like I just said, can you cancel it by an email or text? No. Can you cancel it without giving notice in advance? No. So keep in mind, very important, before either side cancels a transaction, that party through their real estate agent has to use a form. It's called a notice to perform. So seller has to give a notice to buyer to perform. It gives a time period for the seller to remedy the issues. It's 2 days, and cancellation without first giving to notice to buyer perform is a problem. Could be a big problem. It's not allowed under the residential purchase agreement. Why would a buyer side want to cancel? Buyer, they found this house, they think it's the right house for them. Well, maybe the seller doesn't deliver the transfer disclosure statement or the seller property questionnaire timely, or maybe they deliver it and a lot of the boxes aren't even answered. Their agent keeps asking them, "Hey, you didn't check that box about are there any is there any repairs or remodeling done without permits?" And listing agent doesn't respond. Well, that would be a basis for cancellation. Maybe a seller buyer's there to do an inspection and the seller somehow isn't giving proper access to the property. That would be a basis for a buyer to be upset, and that would be a basis for a buyer to cancel. The paragraph 14 of the purchase agreement is the important paragraph for uh, cancellation, and I'll call it my favorite paragraph of the residential purchase agreement, 14D3. It's buyer's right to cancel. I'll read it for you. Perhaps you have one on your desk with you. You could take a look at it after the seminar if you want to. Buyer's right to cancel. Buyer may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any buyer contingency included in paragraph 8 or otherwise agreed, so long as that contingency has not been removed. Paragraph 8 is a loan contingency, an appraisal contingency, an investigation contingency. So a good faith exercise of one of these contingencies allows a buyer to cancel the contract. So a buyer is during the investigation contingency period, let's say it's 10 days. On day 6, buyer does the home inspection. Seller has finally cleaned out the garage. They see that the whole foundation of the garage is crooked and one of the walls of the garage is slanted. They say, I don't want to have to hire a contractor and maybe a structural engineer to spend $50,000 when I move into this house to fix that. I'm canceling the contract. They're allowed to do that under paragraph 14D3 of the purchase agreement. Good faith exercise of these contingencies, especially the investigation contingency, it can be even something more like more vague or subjective. You during your investigation period, you went to the property for an open house, and then you were there with your agent, but then you decide, well, I'm going to drive through that neighborhood on a Saturday night and see what it's like then. You drive through and the neighbor's having a really loud party. There's 20 cars on the street. You want a really quiet house. That is part of your investigation rights. Investigation does not have to be in the inspection report. It can be something else you just kind of see or hear at the house, something about the neighborhood. So if you're within your contingency period, you can cancel for reasons such as that. Remember that, and the purchase agreement is a contract, so you're canceling the contract, but when buyer and seller come into contract, they need somebody else's help to do this transaction. Escrow. Because the real estate agents, they can't hold the funds. They can't prepare the grant deed. They don't record the documents. So they need escrow's help. So there's that separate track that escrow is going on, and escrow has to be separately canceled in addition to the residential purchase agreement between seller and buyer. There is a form. It is called, again, use your forms. To make that a takeaway from today's seminar, use your forms. There is a CAR form called cancellation of contract, release of deposit, and cancellation of escrow. That is the form that is used to cancel the residential purchase agreement. That form, it's really like two forms in one. At the top part of it is cancellation of the contract, but the bottom part is cancellation of the escrow. So the other important thing here is that when you're canceling escrow, escrow probably still has that earnest money deposit in escrow. So the cancellation contract, release of deposit, and cancellation of escrow form, it will also address the return of the deposit to the buyers. So you're canceling the contract. If it's cancellation just by one side, there could be a question or a dispute about is the deposit returned? So you want to try to work out rather than a one-sided cancellation and mutual cancellation between seller and buyer, because escrow cannot release that deposit without mutual agreement of seller and buyer. Another important thing under the purchase agreement to go over some other issues that come up under the purchase agreement. What are some other issues that could come up under the purchase agreement? Time periods for contingencies. We talked about that somewhat, but the default period under the purchase agreement is 17 days for loan, appraisal, investigation of the property, 17 days. That's plenty of time, and you probably want to have a shorter time period as the buyer's agent to make your offer attractive to the seller. So, I recommend 10 days. for investigation of the property. 17 days is the default provision, but to really have a competitive offer as the buyer, most agents would say, let's go shorter than 17 days. Paragraph 9 of the purchase agreement. That is, so you're buying the house, but what's really included in the sale? I mean, there are so many, kind of fixtures, special add-ons to the house, things that make the house special. Like, is the home movie theater equipment included in the sale? Is the smart home system? Are the outdoor lights, hanging across the string of lights across the backyard, are those included in the sale? The Tesla charger that's in the garage and those are not inexpensive items. So when the seller moves out, can he just strip off the wall the Tesla charger? Well, the paragraph 9 of the purchase agreement says all existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. The electric vehicle charger is attached to the wall of the garage. Paragraph 9 of the purchase agreement would suggest that it's part of the sale, but it's easily removed. So if you want that overhead projector in the home theater, or if you want the Tesla charger to still be there when you when you move into the house 2 weeks later, uh, it's paragraph 3, and going through the start of the residential purchase agreement, the summary provision 3P1 references paragraph 9 of the purchase agreement. To be on the safe side, if you want that electric vehicle charger to still be on the wall of the garage when your buyer takes occupancy of that property a few weeks later, you better go to paragraph 3P1 of the purchase agreement and check the box that says electric car charging systems. I would even write on the blank line below that, I would check the box below that and just handwrite in or type in Tesla charger attached to the wall of the garage. If you want to be on the safe side, if you really want the home security system, the home theater system, if you really want those for your buyer, let's check that box at 3P1. Another way to deal with these issues that sometimes agents overlook is, the verification of property condition. It's like a final inspection, takes place a few days before closing, but remember to do those. That is the last time your buyer gets to see the property before escrow closes. So your buyer has probably removed contingencies at that time, but still has some negotiating room, some room to push back on the listing agent if you go by the house then and the home movie theater has been yanked out of the ceiling. So do that verification of property condition. And that there's a form that goes with it. There's a form that says verification of property condition, and it lets you note on the form differences between the property when the offer was made and when you are doing that final check, the verification of property condition. Because under the residential purchase agreement, the seller is obligated to maintain the property in the same condition as it was at the time the offer was accepted, unless it's otherwise specified in the agreement. So the verification of property condition is your opportunity to confirm that. The forms, the residential purchase agreement, obviously for the purchase of the property, but we know that it's typical for a seller and needs some more time to move out. So can you agree that the seller can stay in the property for 20 days after by sending a text message that says that? Perhaps, but use your forms. Really, the legal proper way of doing it under the CAR forms is use the seller license to remain in possession addendum. That's for 30 days or less. So your seller wants to stay in the property for 25 days to move out. That's fine, but use the form that CAR has provided. What if your seller says, I need 60 days? Well, there's a different CAR form that it's residential lease back after sale. Use your forms. And under the residential purchase agreement, one other thing I want to point out to you. Paragraph 29, I talked about it when we were referencing the 3%, the liquidated damages clause. That's paragraph 29. I've had a case where uh, just buyer initialed that paragraph 29, the liquidated damages clause. Seller somehow didn't. It led to trouble. So on your residential purchase agreement, before you send it into escrow, take a look through it. Be sure that buyer and seller, obviously they've signed it and initialed it, signed it at the end, signed it on each page, but check paragraph 29 and be sure that seller and buyer have signed, have initialed paragraph 29. That is what addresses the issue of how long can escrow hold that 3% if a dispute arises? That 3% is intended to forecast what seller may need if buyer cancels or backs out of the agreement without proper cause in breach. But remember, as a buyer, you won't be in breach if you're canceling within your investigation period, within your contingency period for good cause. So those are the highlights of the residential purchase agreement that I want to go over today. I'm happy to discuss anything further, any questions that you all may have. If there's anything else anyone wants to talk about.
Any questions in the room?
Brian, how are you? This is Jimmy. In one of the properties when I had the buyer's agent, we were kind of going through the deal. But then he called me on the weekend saying that I guess the buyers got overwhelmed with the home inspection.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't specify what that meant. I didn't ask him, but they just backed out on it.
Canceled.
Yeah, they canceled.
Canceled.
Proper canceled and all that. So like I said, I'm assuming, I mean, everything was wild, but then I think when they did that drive at night and all that, they realized like, oh no.
Yeah, there can be a real clear reason for backing out of the escrow, like I found mold in the bathroom.
Mhm.
There can be more like, vague, unclear reasons for canceling escrow, like, and they don't even, specify so much, but it's that, we drove by, we just don't like the neighborhood, or I drove by with the entire family and my kids don't like the neighborhood as much as, when, me and my wife drove through. So there can be less clear, kind of vague reasons for canceling. But if the buyer's within that investigation period, they're within their rights to cancel. It could even, just like a buyer changes their mind. If you're the listing agent, I would not go fighting them over that if they're within their contingency period.
Yeah, they were, and I didn't. I just said, okay, that's fine, as
Yeah,
much as I didn't want to, but I was like, well, what can I do? I can't do anything about
Yeah, and authorize the return of the deposit and move on to putting the property back on the market.
it.
I have a question. On the cancellation of escrow, it says it requires a mutually signed escrow instruction. But what if one of them says they have to sign it, if escrow always acts as mutual third party? What if the buyer says, no, I don't want to cancel? What happens to the funds? What happens to them?
Sure. Well, this is why you always first you want to have a good relationship with your buyer's agent. You want to conduct your transaction in professional, ethical manner, of course, and we all do. Because at that point, it really just becomes a negotiation process, a discussion, trying to get the buyer to agree with you. There's no clear, there's no there's no way you could force the buyer to sign it. There isn't a clear remedy for that kind of situation. So, unfortunately, if a buyer wants to dig in his heels and say, I think seller didn't perform. I'm not returning that. Seller, like say, oh, seller, you withheld disclosures from me. I'm not, or you misrepresented something about the property to me. I'm not releasing that. That's the situation where, well, you need to talk to your manager. You need to talk with Peter. Lawyers may need to get involved, and those are more difficult situations.
Brian, can you elaborate on the importance of the cancellation of contract as well as cancellation of escrow? And each it has to be treated independently, and one cancellation doesn't lead to the cancellation of other.
Yeah, that's why I go back to those buzzwords of use your forms, use the CAR forms. So I'm kind of saying this a few times. I like to say it. An email, a text is not cancel a contract. Use your forms. The notice to buyer to perform has to be served, and then the form that's cancellation of contract, release of deposit, cancellation of escrow. Those forms need to be used. So if you're in a situation where you're giving a notice to perform, talk with your manager about it. I mean, they have, the most experience. Go to them. Those are the situations that can get a little more tricky, and you don't want to a week later get a letter from an attorney for someone else, for the buyer, for the other side. Yeah.
Brian, I have a question. Can you explain that even if they don't have the funds in escrow, that we still need to use the cancellation? And then on the second page, the disposition of the funds in escrow, there's a box to check that no funds were in escrow, but it's still important to do both steps, correct, or not?
Absolutely, yes. You can. Escrow can be considered, there can be an escrow without funds actually held by escrow. And you don't want to go relisting a property with, technically an open escrow. So we might think that funds aren't in escrow, so therefore there's not an escrow, but there can be that's not the test. There can be an escrow. Escrow is opened, buyer and seller accept, real estate agent sends the RPA to escrow. There's no funds in escrow at that point, but escrow is open. Escrow is assigned a number, it assigns a number, so there can be an open escrow, even though it seems like just paperwork and numbers. There's still an open escrow, and it leads to more issues, more complications if you are, attempting to resell with an escrow, or I call it technically open escrow. So be sure that you're canceling both.
Thank you.
I have a question, Brian.
Yes.
The buyer and seller, they all sign a document. All of a sudden, somebody dropped it. Would it become another issue?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you that well, sir. So buyer and seller sign.
Everything executed.
Okay, they sign the purchase agreement, right?
Yes.
Okay.
One of them drops dead.
One of them dies.
Oh,
During
one of them dies. So, I mean, the buyer passes away, I'd say that's a basis for seller to cancel. If the seller passes away, I think then it goes into, it raises estate planning issues there. So, I mean, that would be please talk with your manager. Your manager may need to talk with an attorney about it. So then, I mean, we'd have to see, if there's a will, it could depend. Well, and I mean, that's another good thing is when you're a listing agent, one of the first questions asked is who is really your seller? So is your property owned by an individual? Is it owned by an LLC? Is it owned by a trust? So let's say your seller is a trust. Trustee passes away. You talk with your manager, you talk with Peter about it. Maybe you should say, well, let's get a copy of the trust document. Peter could look at it. I could take a look at it. Let's say your trustee passes away. Well, the trust could say that there's a successor trustee. Once the first trustee passes away, automatically successor trustee stands in its place. So if it's a trust in that situation, it may not be as much of a problem. So the governing documents like the LLC operating agreement, like the trust, those documents will determine who steps into the shoes of the seller if seller passes away. So again, my simple answer is that's a talk with your manager situation. And when you talk with your manager, it's probably an issue of how is title held and who comes in next.
Yep.
Good question.
Yeah, good question. Any other questions?
I just assumed that it would become probate and everything had to start all over again. Would it
Not
be?
necessarily. Depends on who holds the title. If it's the trust holding the title, then the trustee, successor trustee becomes the trustee and they will administer the purchase. It doesn't have to be in probate.
It depends, yeah.
A long time ago, it happened to me.
Yeah.
Had to start everything all over.
That's why, so on your listing agreement, when you're on your computer or at home later, pull up a listing agreement that you've used and look at the end of the listing agreement. At the end of the listing agreement, it says that the person signing represents that he has authority to sell the property. So, you want to know how is title really held. And there's also, the issue of is it an LLC, is it a trust? So how is title held? That's the important consideration in this situation.
Go ahead, Herman.
Hi, Brian. My name is Herman. I have a question. If the release of the initial deposit, let's say the buyer in breach of contract, and then but the buyer did not want to sign the release, how long can the seller still sell the property?
So if there's a contract, buyer puts funds into escrow, buyer doesn't perform. You're saying buyer wants to back out, right?
So buyer already passed the contingency period. They already released it, right? Let's say they want to back out after the contingency.
Yeah, that's a
But they don't want to
situation.
sign the release of the fund.
That's a situation where the buyer could be acting contrary to the terms of the agreement, could be in breach. And in that situation, if your contingency date comes, buyer hasn't removed the contingency, I'd say, like within a day, you listing agent would want to give a notice to perform.
No, after the contingency removed.
Okay.
After contingency removed, they still need to sign the buyer's agreement. Both parties need to sign the agreement to release the 3% of the initial deposit, right?
Correct.
What if
Yes.
the buyer doesn't want to sign?
I had a case where the funds were held by escrow for 5 years, if you believe.
But can the seller sell the property, or they can be stuck for 5 years?
So it can, lawyers get involved, it leads to legal disputes. What could happen in that situation is that you want to know if buyer puts a lis pendens on the property. First of all, if a buyer records, we call it the fancy word of lis pendens, like a lien, a notice of a lawsuit on the property. Obviously, if there's a lis pendens, seller can't sue it. But if it just goes into a lawsuit without a lis pendens on the property, and the buyer is just seeking money damages, we call it, not what we call specific performance of the contract, then in that situation, probably the seller can still sell the property, and there's just a dispute with the buyer about when the funds in escrow are going to be released.
So that means nothing then.
Well, the buyer, remember, here's what it goes to, that escrow. Escrow is different from the real estate brokers. They are a neutral party that acts pursuant to instructions from both parties. So they cannot, and sometimes represent escrow companies also. They can't release the funds without an order of the court or an agreement signed by both parties saying it's okay to release them. So in this situation, I mean, this really comes down to, following the contract, working things out, being professional, having good communication, talking with your manager the first time you have a sense there's a problem, talking with your manager.
So what is the point of initial deposit then? If the buyer or seller cannot claim it?
The point is to give the seller confidence that he should proceed with this buyer. So I'm selling you a $2 million house, but in 3 days you can't come up with 3% of that, like $50,000. I mean, seller would say, come on, if you don't have about $50,000 within a few days of acceptance of this contract, I don't want to waste my time with you. I'm moving on to someone who has $50,000 that they can show me within a few days.
So it's not.
That's the purpose of it. But
for the liquidated damage then, right?
yeah, here's the other lesson to learn. I see cases where buyers are making, multiple offers. Say they're making 3 offers at one time, and they're putting in deposits on all those offers because they have to. I mean, putting in a $30,000 deposit, that's real money to most of us. So I think the lesson learned is be really wary about making multiple offers at the same time and make an offer, when you're serious about a property. So I hope that helps. Does that help a little bit? Make some sense there?
Yeah, it's just
Maybe.
kind of funny having that initial deposit, but seller
And then
can.
the other lesson to learn, like I said at the start of the seminar, so if buyer's gonna put in 3% to satisfy the contract, but aggressive listing agent is saying, no, it's got to be 5%, that's a red flag. 3% is the standard that the California Association of Realtors has established. If your seller and your listing agent are being more aggressive, they're saying it's got to be 4%, it's got to be 5%, I've got to have more. That's a red flag. Think twice about that transaction. Talk with your manager.
Yep. Thank you.
So,
Want to take them?
anyone else?
Can we-
Anything?
Can we put on the clause when on the purchase on the counter or something that initial deposit will be released without mutual agreement? No, right?
No, and here's why.
No.
This is an interesting principle because this residential purchase agreement I've been talking about today, it's an agreement between who? Between seller and buyer. Escrow is not a party to it. A deposit is held by escrow. And escrow is separate, so that's why you couldn't add that onto the residential purchase agreement.
But during escrow, you can have a mutual agreement to have some of the fund be released to the seller, non-refundable.
You could, yes.
But
yes.
after we open the escrow,
Yes.
so we make an addendum during the
It's
escrow
just
period before the
escrow
condition.
instruction, if both parties
both parties
agree to have a partial release of fund to the seller, that can be done.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that then.
Peter, anyone, Michelle, anything else? Anything else?
No, that was
Okay.
very informative.
So, you all, I think you received my outline, so keep it with you. You can refer to it. Please reach out to Peter and Michelle with questions.
Michelle, somebody's asking.
Okay, we got a chat question. Hold on.
Okay.
Let me look at it. Okay, how can we get rid of the risk of a lease back after closing escrow?
How can you get rid of the risk? Well,
Lease back?
Lease back after
A-
closing?
I think giving a short lease back is somewhat of a courtesy to the seller. I think it's typical, but it's a negotiated term. It's a part of the negotiation. I mean, buyer is not required to agree to a lease back after close of escrow. You can say, I'm sorry, I need to get into this. I need to move in. The kids are starting school. I have to move in. That is a term of my offer. If you can't give that to me, we're not able to do this contract.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay,
right.
well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brian. This was really informative. We appreciate it very much, and see you on the next one. Thank you, everybody. We'll
Thank you,
see
Michelle.
on
Thank you,
Friday.
Peter. Thank you, everyone. Good to see you
Bye-bye.
all. Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Virginia.